started. Okay, so understanding and preventing aggression in dogs. So today we're going to be looking at how we kind of define aggression, how aggression can be categorized, understanding the link between fear and aggression, just a little bit of a look at as well why aggression does actually develop in the first place, or why it might develop in the first place, how we can kind of prevent aggression from developing as well. And then we're going to look at how we can predict an aggressive incident when it might occur or if it might occur. And then we're just going to finally have a look at where you can find further support. If you are experiencing aggression in your dog, or if you're looking for more resources on learning about aggression and learning more yourself. Okay, so to start off with, we're going to have a look at how do we define aggression. And there's a really, really good definition given by Horowitz and Landsberg. And they defined aggression as, aggression is defined as threats or harmful actions directed towards another individual, and that can include threat displays, so things like lunging, growling, snarling, snapping, and biting. In animals, aggressive behaviours are a means of communication. Okay, which is really, really important as well. It's a way to let another animal know that for whatever reason, a particular individual is not comfortable with something generally. Dogs and cats use aggressive displays, threats and attacks to resolve competitive disputes over resources. So resources can mean territory, that can mean food, that can mean shelter, that can mean potentially a toy or some sort of object. Or to increase their reproductive potential. So that's potentially if you've got some sort of aggressive altercation to decide who's going to mate with a particular other animal. Or also to escape threatening situations. So again, if an animal is feeling threatened, one of the biggest responses or biggest times that we kind of see aggression occur is as a way to escape a threatening situation. So that's kind of one definition of aggression, and it's quite a hard thing to kind of define because there are so many different situations in which it occurs. So if you're kind of seeing an aggressive behavior, it doesn't necessarily tell you anything about the cause of that behavior in itself. So what might cause aggression? So there's kind of a few different categories, or a few different broad categories that we generally use to sort of define or to categorize aggression. The first category, probably the most common category of aggression that we see in dogs, is fear-induced aggression. So this is when a dog is fearful of perhaps unknown people. It might be known people, it might be unknown dogs or known dogs. It might be a physical threat, or also a threat to young as well. So if the animal's got sort of young animals around that they're worried about kind of protecting as well. And fear-induced aggression is simply a way of making whatever threat it may be that the dog's perceived as a threat. So whether that's a genuine threat, whether it's an incorrectly perceived threat, so maybe just an unknown person trying to walk down the road, but for whatever reason the dog has processed that person as a threat. The aim of that aggressive behavior, whether it's kind of very defensive, whether it's even quite offensive, is to neutralize that threat and get rid of that threat, so the animal is once again safe and no longer having to worry about that threat. So it's simply a mechanism of survival and a way to get rid of any potential threats so the animal can survive and the dog can survive and be safe and not have to worry about that threat anymore. So it's a way to kind of maintain survival. We also see resource guarding aggression. So this is when an animal or a dog has a particular resource. That might be some food, it might be their dinner, it might be a bone, it might be some territory as well, it might be their home, it might be even their park, or what they consider their local park, or it might be a particular person around the house. And this is particularly common in dogs that haven't had big sort of attachment figures in their life, and maybe have been integrated into a home and become really, really attached to their people, is they can actually start to guard their person as well. So resource guarding is, again, it's a type of fear-based behavior, because if we kind of think of dogs in an evolutionary environment where they've spent most of their time evolving, they wouldn't necessarily get another meal if they lost it. They wouldn't necessarily find another safe place to sleep if they lost it. So it's actually again a fear-related behaviour, because if you lose your food, that might mean you die, or if you lose your shelter spot, that also might mean you die. So again, resource guarding also comes in to that kind of category of fear-related behaviours. So these kind of first two are very, very much fear-related. The next form of aggression is disease or pain-induced aggression, and this is particularly when dogs that maybe have a bit of an anxious disposition already, or maybe you're experiencing lots and lots of pain, and they start to become aggressive to, might be their owners again, it might be unknown people, it might be other dogs, simply because again they are fearful of generally being hurt more or being or losing their life, because they're in a kind of compromised position of being suffering from disease or being in pain. We also see conflict-related aggression, which is when we see kind of aggression generally between dogs. So that might be one dog kind of irritating another dog, one dog. Quite often a key one for that is if you've got a new puppy and an older dog might become a little bit irritated with the puppy and display some aggression. So it's kind of more of an annoyance-related aggression, that one, but it can also be fear-related, because if you've got a puppy that's being really, really full-on, or you've got another dog that's being really, really full-on, that dog could potentially pose a risk if it's not kind of, again, stopped, know that behaviour is not appropriate. That could potentially be a risk for the dog as well. So conflict-related aggression and disease and pain-related aggression are not so strongly fear-based, but they are quite fear-related as well. And they certainly can potentially be related to fears. We also see redirected aggression. So this is, again, when an animal's in a situation where they're very stressed out or they've experienced some fear themselves, and as a way to kind of manage that stress and manage that fear and manage those kind of uncomfortable emotions, they redirect some of their aggression or redirect some behaviors towards another animal or another object. So you might kind of think of the human analogy is if someone's had a bad day at work, they might go home and take it out on their other family members. They might be a bit grumpy with their family members or something like that. And that would be an example of redirected aggression. We kind of see very similar things in dogs. If a dog's had a bad day or if a dog's quite stressed, they might be more prone to aggressive behaviour because actually it gives them some relief from their own stress. And again, that can very much relate to fear, because if a dog's stressed because they're experiencing fear, then they again may choose to redirect some of that stress and redirect that in the form of aggression. So again, these kind of next three are not strictly going to be always caused by fear, but in many, many cases, these are all fear related as well. So a lot of the kind of big categories of aggression are very much related or related in some way to fear and that kind of emotion fear in dogs. And ultimately, fear is very much related to helping the animal stay alive. And the final category of aggression that we're not really going to go too much into today, it's generally not a form of aggression that causes any problems except in very, very rare cases, is predatory aggression, which is when you might see a dog chasing things like squirrels or chasing things like any sort of prey animal, and that's a very, very normal behaviour for the dog. It's not kind of abnormal in the sense that all the previous ones are, in which that you hopefully don't want to see in your dog. Predatory behaviour is a normal behaviour in the dog, and it's actually a sign of fairly good welfare if a dog is actually displaying predatory behaviour, because they're displaying a normal behaviour pattern and they've spent years evolving to predate on things. So it's very, very normal for them to display that every now and again. It's only in very, very extreme cases where a dog might start displaying predatory aggression inappropriately, maybe towards a human, generally a younger human, that it can cause a problem. But that is genuinely very, very rare. So I think the kind of the big message from this kind of slide is aggression is a really, really good strategy to eliminate fear. It's a really good way of making fear go away, because if you, for example, if you're scared by an unknown person and you growl at them and you bark at them and you bite them, then generally they will go away. Even if you've got a dog that you're walking on a lead in the streets and they have a bit of a bark at a person and the person isn't particularly bothered by it, still by nature of walking out in the streets, that person's eventually going to go away. So that strategy is going to be reinforced because the dog's going to think, oh, I did a great job there. I had a bark at that person and they went away. Similarly, if you think of things very common kind of victims of aggression, which is the postman. If a postman or a delivery driver comes along and delivers something, or and the dog barks at the postal worker or the delivery driver, again, it's not necessarily the thing that's making them go away, but they will eventually go away because they'll have to go on to their next job. So the dog's going to think, oh, I did a great job. I just saved everyone's life from the postal worker, or I just saved everyone's life from the delivery driver. So again, it's quite reinforcing, because aggression generally in kind of the world works as a strategy of eliminating that kind of fear and eliminating those uncomfortable feelings in dogs. Similarly, pain, disease-induced aggression. Someone's coming too close. Someone's making the dog feel uncomfortable. Someone's making the dog feel fearful. If the dog has a growl, if the dog has a snap, if the dog has a bite potentially, that's probably going to make the person back off and go away. So it's a very successful strategy. It's a successful strategy because it puts that kind of fear onto the other person, gets rid of that person, and generally increases the distance between the dog and the threat, and makes them feel better and makes them feel safer. Okay, so the next thing we're going to look at is with relation to kind of this emotion of fear and how it kind of influences our dogs, is what might cause a dog to experience fear. And generally, there's quite a lot of things that could potentially cause a dog to experience fear. So firstly, it might be new or unknown people or dogs. So new and unknown people or dogs are probably one of the most common causes of fear in kind of the domestic dog. We get dogs that are what we call people reactive, and generally that's because they're experiencing some fear around people, so they might respond aggressively around people. They might respond by running away around people. But again, in this context, we're generally looking at those dogs that respond aggressively to people. And similarly, you might have dogs that are dog reactive, and they might respond aggressively to dogs that they see out and about. And again, that can be context specific. It might relate to people or new or unknown people or new or unknown dogs within their territory. So it might relate to that kind of territorial aggression. But it also might just be more of a general thing in terms of people or dogs generally. We know that dogs can also develop kind of aversions or fear around new or unknown objects or stimuli. So it's not necessarily a living animal or person that's going to cause that fear. It can be something like an object that's unfamiliar, something like a new appliance, like a vacuum cleaner or a dishwasher. It might be a sound, so something like fireworks, so kind of sounds and lights. Fireworks is a very big one that can cause kind of stress for many dogs. It might be smells as well. So it might be where another dog's peed that a dog experiences some fear around. It might be a new smell around the house. So kind of if someone's got a new air freshener, that could potentially cause some fear for a dog. It's generally quite rare to see a dog respond aggressively to an air freshener, but it's still worth mentioning just in the context of understanding fear in dogs. Familiar people as well that behave in a threatening way. So it might be that actually the dog's got on very well with a person, but a person moves in a certain way or responds to something in a certain way, and that causes some fear. Again, it might be a certain sound someone makes. Someone might shout, and that might cause some fear for the dog. And this is particularly common if you're thinking in the terms of rescue dogs, or dogs that have had previous homes where they might have learned some negative associations between particular movements or particular sounds, and maybe some sort of punisher, so maybe some physical punisher or something like that. So it might be that they've been abused in the past, they've got used to hearing a shout and knowing that actually predicts them about to be hit or something like that. And that learning might carry across to familiar people, even if the people have been very friendly to the dog, always looked after the dog. If the person moves in the wrong way and triggers that kind of memory of potentially being abused or something like that, then that can cause some fear. As we discussed earlier, risk of losing resources can cause fear. So that might be human resources, resources or humans that they consider resources, food, water, territory, dogs, particularly offspring as well. And also pain and disease in itself can potentially cause fear, and that fear can generally be exacerbated by something coming too close in relation to pain and disease. So those are a few causes of fear, and I suppose the next kind of interesting question that leads on from there is, why do some dogs experience fear in these scenarios and some dogs not? And there are kind of quite a few reasons for that. And we're just going to go very, very briefly through some of these potential causes of fear and aggression to develop in dogs. So we're going to have a little look at genetics of the dog and how that might influence their development of aggression. Also learning history, the way their early development, so kind of when they're with their mum for those first few weeks of life and those first few months of life as well. And also the dog's biology, so whether they're neutered, and their ability to also regulate their own emotions. So we're going to start off with genetics. And there's quite a few interesting things that we can kind of observe in the dog's genetics that will influence their behaviour and whether fear and potentially aggressive behaviours will develop. So this is just a very, very brief overview. There's certainly a lot more to genetics and all these things than this, but this is just to give you some ideas in terms of how these kind of different factors can influence your dog's behaviour and potentially influence whether your dog might display aggressive behaviour. So one thing is breed differences. So there are some differences between breeds in terms of their most kind of common behavioural traits. So one kind of key one, or a dog that's quite often associated a little bit more with aggressive behaviour, are German Shepherds. And that's because they have actually been bred to be more aggressive, because they've been bred as kind of guard dogs in many cases. So German Shepherds are generally slightly more prone to aggressive behaviour than other dogs. And one of the reasons for this is because they start experiencing their fear responses at a younger age generally than other dogs. So during their kind of first few weeks of life, dogs don't really have any fear, or they don't really have kind of the chemical processes in place yet to allow them to experience fear in the same way that older dogs would. And German Shepherds actually start being able to experience fear at a slightly younger age than other dogs, at about 5 weeks. Other dogs generally start experiencing about 7, 8 weeks, some are around 6 weeks, but German Shepherds are about one of the earliest dogs to start experiencing fear. And that means that actually they have less time to be introduced to a lot of the things in the world in that kind of fear-free environment, because that fear-free environment is a really, really good way to show puppies that actually humans are okay, handling is okay, all sorts of things that you're going to meet in the world are okay. And actually you've got 1 week less potentially, or a few weeks less potentially, to do that with a German Shepherd, which does make life more difficult for them. Also, there are some sex differences between dog behaviour and kind of their likelihood of developing aggressive behaviours. Males are marginally more likely to develop aggressive behaviours than female dogs. It's not a massive difference. Still, lots of female dogs can experience aggressive behaviour and can develop aggressive behaviour as well, but it's slightly more common in male dogs. And also, the actual breeding line can make a difference. So aggression is a heritable behaviour. Dogs can inherit it from their parents. So this isn't necessarily the most strong effect, but it is still relevant. So this is again where you can look at the dog's parents, you can look at the dog's grandparents even, and you can look at their behaviour. And actually, if their parents are displaying aggressive behaviour, then generally the dog's slightly more at risk of or displaying aggressive behaviour themselves. So the next thing that we can have a look at is development, and kind of how dogs develop and how that might influence their likelihood of developing fear-based responses and aggressive behaviour. So one thing we know that actually if the dog's mum has a stressful pregnancy, then that can lead to enhanced stress responses in pups. So if your mum's kind of been stressed, maybe malnourished, maybe they've just not had those kind of safety needs met in terms of feeling safe, feeling like they're going to be fed regularly, all those kind of needs that you'd hope a dog would have met during pregnancy, if they were perhaps not met, then that can lead to offspring that have enhanced stress responses. So offspring that are much more likely to respond with kind of stress, or respond or experience stress in certain situations. So their kind of tolerance for stress is generally much less. So again, one thing that we can do with dogs is, if you are in a position to do so, is actually make sure that the parent is having a really stress-free pregnancy, that make sure all their needs are being met in order to promote healthy, happy, fear-free puppies. Another thing is actually once the pup's been born is the quality and the quantity of the maternal care. So we know that having more time spent with the dog's mum and also higher quality care in terms of actually the way and means that the mum uses to kind of lick and care and groom and interact with their pups affects aggression in later life. So the more high quality interactions that the pup gets with their mum, the less likely or the more protected they are against aggression in later life. In particular, that kind of time with mum, ideally you want 8 weeks at the very, very least, but there's also some research, or quite a lot of research, hopefully, that's going to be coming out soon and is kind of starting to filter through, that kind of suggests that actually generally puppies need generally a lot longer than 8 weeks with their mum. And we know kind of in a natural environment, dogs will generally live with their parents up until about a year old. And 50% of puppies won't ever really leave their family group, and those that do, yeah, leave their mum and their family group at about a year old. So it's quite different, the kind of the process that puppies go through when they're being sold from a breeder at 8 weeks, and really 8 weeks should be the absolute minimum. And legally it's the absolute minimum, but really we should hopefully be looking at increasing it to more than 8 weeks that the puppy gets to spend with their mum, because it makes such a big difference to their kind of coping ability and aggression levels and general welfare levels in later life. So obviously this talk's just looking at aggression, but it makes a difference in lots of different ways to their general stress levels and in later life. Another thing that's really key during those early developmental stages is the amount of socialization a dog gets. So this means the amount of time that people spend introducing them to all the different stimuli that they're going to see in the world. So that might be humans, that might be dogs, that might be handling itself, that might be things like just roads and streets and areas and the kind of the general area that they're going to live, other dogs, other animals, particularly if they're going to be living with other animals. So this is particularly key during their kind of first few weeks. So between about 3 and 12 weeks, it's particularly key. There's kind of this sensitive period where puppies are particularly responsive to socialization, but also just generally throughout their first year, it's good to spend lots of time in a controlled way, in such a way that you're not eliciting fear, spending time introducing puppies kind of at their pace to all the different things they're going to be potentially interacting with in the world. And this again has a really good protective effect against aggression, because it's going to reduce the puppy's fear around all those stimuli. It means that when the puppy goes into the vets, the puppy's thinking, oh, brilliant, I've done this before. Generally, I get a treat when I do this before. When someone lifts up my ear, it's great. It's no problem. It's fine. All those things is kind of familiar to the puppy when they interact with them in a real life scenario, which again prevents that fear and hopefully again that aggression or that aggressive response from developing. So the other thing we've got to consider is the dog's learning history. So firstly, kind of their previous learning. And there's a process called classical conditioning, which is when a dog learns to associate a particular stimuli or a particular thing happening with a particular response. So kind of the classic example is a dog learns to associate a bell ringing with their dinner. But that can also happen kind of in the flip side in a negative way. So a dog can learn to associate something, for example, an unknown human with pain, and that can lead to a fear response being triggered. So for example, if you've got a puppy that has seen an unknown human, or maybe a human that wears dark glasses, or a human that wears a hat, and maybe that human's come a bit close, or maybe that human's even accidentally or hopefully not on purpose caused some sort of pain to the puppy. Or one common one is if the puppy goes to the vets and sees a human kind of wearing scrubs, and that person injects the puppy, or maybe there's a temperature check on the puppy, and that's caused the puppy to experience some pain. And that will lead to a fear response being triggered. So the puppy starts to learn that these things happen in future. So the puppy starts to learn, okay, when I see a human in scrubs, or when I see a human in glasses, that predicts pain, and I should experience fear in that scenario. And obviously when the puppy's experiencing that fear response, one of the strategies that they might choose to deal with that fear is responding aggressively. And this is just again one example, this unknown human predicting pain, triggering a fear response. You can interchange all sorts of different things in there. So for example, you can have an unknown dog, predicts loss of food because maybe someone's let the older dog steal the puppy's food one too many times, and that's caused some fear to be triggered, which might lead to some inter-dog aggression problems within a household as well. So it's really, really important to think about those early experiences a puppy gets, and also those experiences that a dog gets generally, in terms of what that's going to lead to them learning, and what that's going to lead to them learning about how the world works, in terms of if they see an unknown dog, that's dangerous, because that might predict food loss. And another one, which is really, really common that people kind of let happen to their puppies, just as I'm constantly going back to puppies at the moment, is they go and let the puppies get told off by an older dog, which is, again, generally not a great thing. So it's not great for the older dog because it's leading them to develop some negative associations with puppies, but it's also not great for the puppy because it's leading the puppy to actually develop some fear of older dogs. And yeah, we want our puppies to behave appropriately around older dogs, and there's all sorts we can do to help them behave appropriately around older dogs, but getting them told off by older dogs is a bit of a gamble, because it might lead to them, if you're lucky, becoming scared of older dogs and generally running away from them and not getting too close. So that's okay, not too bad, but probably not ideal for the puppy that you want to take out on walks every day and to be going around terrified of all the older dogs it sees, or some older dogs it might see. Or worst case scenario, it might lead to the puppy kind of growing up and starting to respond aggressively in those scenarios with older dogs, because it actually, again, it's learned that older dogs predict pain, and that's, again, triggering a fear response, because that prediction of pain is potentially a threat to survival. Another aspect of learning history that is really, really important is whether a dog's experienced trauma in the past. So that can be things like being left alone for too long. It can be things like abuse. It can be all sorts of different things. But dogs that have experienced sort of previous trauma are also more likely to develop fearfulness. They're more likely to develop aggression towards humans, and then much more likely to develop aggression towards other animals as well. So that learning history can have a big impact on a dog's behaviour as well. And the final thing we're just going to look at today in terms of how things can influence whether aggression develops is a dog's biology. So one key thing to look at is the neutering status of dogs. So male dogs, fear-based aggression is actually significantly more likely to be to develop in dogs that were castrated at a lower age, at a younger age. So generally, if you've got a dog that's castrated very, very young, they're slightly more prone to developing fear-based aggression. Actually, there's a similar thing in female dogs, in the sense that there's generally a higher incidence of female or fearful behaviour, aggressive behaviour, and excitability in dogs with less exposure to gonadal hormones. So again, if a female dog has been used at a younger age, then they are more prone to developing fearful behaviour, aggressive behaviour, and excitability than dogs that are used at an older age or not used at all. So that is a consideration to make in when it does come to neutering dogs, and there's lots and lots of kind of pros and cons to consider in the case of neutering dogs, and we sadly can't get into all of them today. But again, with regards to fear, neutering is not going to reduce fear. It's not going to stop the fear-based behaviours from occurring. So it's not a good intervention from that point of view. And there is the risk that it is going to potentially lead to higher instances of fear behaviour as well. So when we're working with dogs that are fearful or prone to fear-based behaviour, whether that's through their genetics, whether that's through some history that they've had that could lead to them potentially developing fear-based behaviour, it's worth thinking carefully and having a discussion with your vet carefully about whether you neuter, whether you consider some other options by way of neutering that will kind of lead to the dog not being reproductively intact, that aren't going to lead to those hormonal changes that might influence aggressive behaviour as well. And also the other thing to consider is the dog's ability to emotionally regulate. So a dog's ability to regulate their own emotions is linked to so many different things. So this can include lots of different chemicals that we kind of get in the brain, so neurotransmitters like serotonin. It can also be influenced by hormones such as cortisol, which is a really key hormone that's involved in stress. And also then nutrition can have an impact on whether they're able to regulate emotionally. So nutrition is big for influencing the levels of an amino acid called tryptophan, which is actually a precursor to serotonin, which is that hormone or that neurotransmitter, sorry, in the brain, which is really, really key for emotional regulation. And also another really interesting topic at the moment that, again, we don't have time to dive into too much today, is the gut microbiome and how that can influence aggressive behavior. And again, the kind of the health of an animal's, or a dog in particular, in this case, is gut microbiome, can have a big effect on whether a dog responds aggressively or not. One reason for this is because a lot of serotonin is actually produced in the gut. And some other reasons potentially are again linked to kind of how well the gut's communicating with the brain and able to kind of let the brain know of certain signals in terms of the body, and that way as well. And again, it's kind of all building up the research as well in terms of how the gut microbiome does affect behavior, but there are some really interesting potential ways. And if anyone's interested, message me afterwards, and I can send you some links to that as well, as it's a really interesting topic. I'm trying to refrain myself from talking about it for too long, as I will run over. So one question that I'm often asked in relation to aggression is it related to dominance, and is it related to sort of dominance behaviours, and whether I'm actually kind of an owner dominating their dog or taking control over their dog is going to reduce aggression. And unfortunately, it's not that simple, because it would be great if you could just put in some dominance-based interventions and that would solve the aggression problem. But unfortunately, that's not really how dog behavior works. That's not really how social groups in dogs work. It tends to come from a bit of a misunderstanding that this idea that implementing harsh techniques such as alpha rolls and not letting your dog go through the door first, at best, that's generally going to just confuse your dog. At worst, that can potentially increase the aggression because you're potentially increasing fear in the dog of you. Dominance hierarchies can sometimes be observed within groups of dogs, but this is generally not something the dogs are consciously aware of. So it's just a reflection of whether the dog decides to allow another dog to have a particular resource or they don't. So for example, in, again, a free-ranging scenario, where resources are very limited, which is, again, not too common. It's not too common that you see these dominance hierarchies develop, because generally resources are free-flowing enough that it's not needed. But in a situation where resources are very limited, you sometimes get this kind of hierarchy, which can be observed in terms of whether dog A or dog B gets access to food or gets access to a particular sleeping spot when they want it. And generally one of the dogs will defer and say, no, it's all right, dog A, you can have that resource, or no, it's all right, dog B, you can have that sleeping space, and give it up. So there's not generally any aggression even involved in that process. It's just kind of a way that dogs learn that, okay, well, that dog's kind of a little bit more sort of tough, a little bit more posturing a little bit more strongly and a little bit more invested, perhaps even as well, in that particular resource. So I'm going to let him have it, as it's just a way to avoid conflict that these hierarchies kind of develop. So again, kind of the key message here is don't try and dominate your dog. It's not going to help with any of the issues they're having. It's potentially going to lead them to develop fear of you, and it's going to increase their stress levels further, which again could potentially lead to redirected aggression. It could lead to the dog struggling to learn, and actually when you're trying to overcome that aggression, making it much harder because the dog's constantly stressed. If you're going to alpha roll them, or you're going to not allow them to go through the door first, or something like that, it's just generally quite confusing for them. The other thing to consider is whether you use punishment as a way to manage aggression. But again, this is a tricky one, because if you're punishing an aggressive behavior, you're potentially going to lead to that fear being increased further. And there's quite a lot of research done on punishment in terms of how it affects dog behavior and how it affects kind of just generally how dogs behave. And it's generally not the best thing. Because although it does work to reduce the behavior in some cases, so particularly if you've got an unwanted behavior like the dog jumping up too much or something like that, it does work, but it does have quite a lot of side effects. There's quite a big fallout or potential fallout. So generally dogs that are punished display increased vigilance and over-pleasing of the owner. And they also quite often try to avoid the owner around the house. So that might be things like poor recall and spending less time with the owner around the house. They quite often have higher cortisol levels as well. So that's that hormone that we see generally during stress, which can mean that they're more prone to stress-related disease. It can mean they're more prone to increased barking, increased mounting, and more frequent abnormal behavior development. It also means that their attachment bonds to their humans are likely to be less secure. And we're going to talk about attachment bonds in a little bit and how those are really, really key when you're helping or when you're trying to prevent aggressive behavior and understand aggressive behavior as well. And just as a kind of side note, dogs trained with positive reinforcement have generally been found to be the most obedient. And that might be because the dog trainers that use positive reinforcement are quite aware of dog training and why they should be using positive reinforcement and what those benefits are. So it might be that generally better trainers generally use positive reinforcement. But what it does show you is that dogs that are trained with positive reinforcement can at least be as good, if not better, than dogs trained with other methods. And again, with punishment-based methods, whether that's physical punishment or whether that's just inflicting fear on the dog, whether that's through shouting, whether that's through some sort of physical correction, that will increase the dog's risk of redirected aggression. So that might be again towards people, that might be towards other dogs, or towards the owner, or if you're lucky, just towards an object around the house. So again, really, really trying to avoid punishment is key for preventing aggressive behavior and not increasing aggressive responses. So how do we prevent aggression? So there's a few things we're going to run through in terms of how we can really work to prevent our dogs from behaving aggressively. Quick sip of water as it is boiling. So firstly, we're going to look at how we can really promote a healthy and a happy dog. So our dogs are in a really, really good emotional and physical place in order to prevent aggression. We're looking at how we can meet our dog's needs as well. So meeting those kind of biological behavioral needs of the dog is really, really key in order for dogs to feel happy, for dogs to learn, and for dogs to not experience stress. And we know that when a dog's stressed, that fear response is generally much more prone to occurring. So dogs are much more likely to experience fear when they're stressed. And it's also really key to understand the antecedent triggers. And by antecedent triggers I'm meaning those triggers that happen before an aggressive response, those things that cause the aggressive response to happen. It's also really good to be able to read your dog's body language so you know that your dog's starting to experience some fear and you can remove them from that situation. And we're going to look at kind of what body language signals you want to be looking for in those cases. And finally, we're going to look at how we can address that emotional response, how we can address that fear response. And we're not going to get into into that in such a big degree today because it is such a big topic, how we can address that emotional fear response. And this is kind of preventing aggression rather than resolving aggression. But hopefully I'm going to just try and signpost you to some places where you can find some support in that area, whether you're wanting to learn more about it or if you're looking for help with your own dog. So firstly, promoting a healthy, happy dog. So some things in this should be quite obvious to you. So keeping your dog healthy. Health conditions are often linked to aggression. This is really, really interesting. Again, we know that pain, disease is linked to aggression. Some particular ones as things like visceral pain, musculoskeletal pain, any sort of painful conditions generally. But also things like gastrointestinal disease is really, really commonly linked to aggression. And aggressive behavior as well. So really making sure the dog's healthy, so making sure the dog's having regular kind of yearly or at the very least vet checks, and making sure the dog's got a healthy diet as well, and their exercise needs are being met is really, really key in terms of keeping the dog healthy. And also meeting their behavioral needs, so actually making sure the dog feels safe. Dogs need to feel safe to be able to relax and be able to kind of manage their stress. It's a kind of core need for dogs. Making sure they have appropriate enrichment activities, so things like being able to chew, being able to forage, being able to play. A strong attachment figure is really key with the compassionate training methods as well. So we're going to talk about attachment in a minute and how we can promote strong attachments with our dogs. And again, if you are looking for kind of advice in terms of how we can meet a dog's behavioural needs, I've done another webinar called Reducing Stress in Dogs, which is really, really good for understanding all those things. And if you want access to that, message me and I can give you access to a recording of that. So one way to kind of look at dogs' needs or canine needs is through something called the canine hierarchy of needs. And it's just quite a good way to understand some of those core needs for dogs that need to be met in order for dogs to be able to kind of learn and process things properly and feel happy and promote good welfare. So this is, again, a really, really good resource. At the bottom of this hierarchy, we can kind of see their biological needs. So this is things like being able to feel safe. So being able to feel safe is absolutely key and kind of the biggest first one on there. So even to be able to eat, to be able to drink, to be able to groom, to be able to sleep properly, the dog needs to be able to feel safe. But also, again, making sure the dog's eating properly, making sure the dog's eating in a way that kind of fits its species as well. So looking at having those options to kind of maybe chew stuff up, be able to kind of do a bit of foraging, do a bit of exploring like a dog would. Also making sure they're drinking appropriately, obviously, because if you've got a thirsty dog, they're not really feeling too comfortable, they might be a little bit grumpy. Also, water or hydration is key for brain functioning as well, so they're not going to be able to learn as well if they're not hydrated. Also grooming, because if they're not groomed, they're potentially going to feel uncomfortable, particularly long-haired dogs, not such an issue with short-haired dogs. And also sleep. Sleep is really, really key for kind of managing some of those chemicals in the body, like serotonin, like cortisol, in terms of helping to promote good serotonin levels and helping for the body to reduce its cortisol levels. And then it kind of moves on to emotional needs. So that's things like love, trust, a consistent environment, predictability, and affection. So that's really, again, looking to make sure the dog's kind of getting that interaction from their human. They've got a nice, safe home environment as well that's going to help them feel secure, and looking at how things can be predictable as well. Also their social needs, so bonding to people, bonding to other dogs, fun, regular play with other dogs if that's appropriate for them. If you've got a dog that responds aggressively or fearfully around other dogs, then it might not be appropriate for them, and that's fine. But if you've got a dog that maybe responds fearfully for humans, play with other dogs is going to be valuable. Equally, if you've got another dog that responds fearfully to other dogs, then play with humans is going to be valuable to them. So giving them those social opportunities for positive interactions is key. It's not so much a need as such, but particularly if you are working on behaviour problems, reinforcement-based training is quite key. And also looking at their cognitive needs, so actually maybe providing things like some frustration-free puzzles, some scent games, some choices. That's really, really good for kind of meeting their cognitive needs, and that's, again, promoting good mood, promoting good welfare, and reducing the chances of aggressive behaviour, because it helps kind of manage some of those chemicals in the body as well. So the next thing we're going to look at is kind of how the environment might influence aggression, and in particular looking at how we can manage our dog's internal environment in terms of how we can influence some of those chemicals in the dog's body that might change how they respond. So some key chemicals to think about in terms of aggression are firstly something called GABA, which is gamma aminobutyric acid, which is a neurotransmitter in the brain, which has an inhibitory effect on the fear center in the brain called the amygdala. So there's this kind of little center in the brain. It's very, very small. It looks like an almond, and it's really key for responding fearfully. It's the part of the brain that when we see a lion running towards us or something scary happening, that lights up and lets us know that we need to do something about this. We need to run away or try and fight it. It's that part of the brain. And there's this neurotransmitter called GABA that helps calm down that part of the brain and helps tell it to chill out and not to worry. So that's going to be key for what we're talking about in a minute. Serotonin is another key one. It's a neurotransmitter, again, in the brain that's really key for helping manage all those emotional systems in the brain. So helping manage those fear responses, helping the kind of the rational side of the brain let the emotional side of the brain know that they don't need to panic, or they don't need to get overexcited, or they don't need to respond in a silly way to something, or in a fearful way to something. It helps kind of manage that emotional regulation. It helps dogs cope, or helps any animal or any mammal really cope with things. And another key chemical is cortisol, which is a hormone which kind of runs through the bloodstream, which prepares the body for stressful situations. So if you've got high levels of cortisol, then your body's going to be preparing for stressful situations and more likely to process things as stressful. So, for example, cortisol makes that area, again, the amygdala, more excitable. It makes it more reactive to potential stressors. So if you've got a dog that's got lots of cortisol in their system and they see maybe another dog across the side of their road, then they're more likely to react than that same dog that hasn't got lots of cortisol in their system, particularly if that dog experiences fear generally around other dogs. So how can we balance these chemicals? There's a few things we can do. So gentle exercise is really, really good for promoting serotonin. Another key thing for promoting serotonin is sleep. And dogs need 12 to 16 hours sleep per day. Stressy dogs or anxious dogs or fearful dogs generally need a little bit more sleep. So generally they're going to lean much more on the 14, 15 hours of sleep per day rather than those dogs that are maybe not so stressed that can get away with the 12 hours of sleep. So really making sure the dog's getting enough sleep during the day is key, or during a 24-hour period, I should say. So that can be overnight, that can be during the day as well. Really making sure you try to get to at least 12 hours during a 24-hour period is really important. Also, lots of chewing opportunities are key. So chewing in opportunities promote the transmission of that neurotransmitter GABA, which helps calm down the amygdala. So looking at things like dog chews, looking at things like Kongs, potentially you can freeze Kongs and get some chewing out of that. It might be things like toys, it might be things like deer antlers, buffalo horns. There's all sorts of things that you can potentially give your dog to chew on. Bones as well are a great one as well, because the dog gets to dissect them as well, which is a great natural behavior for them. Also low energy exercise. So really looking for low energy exercise is great because it helps kind of a dog better manage those cortisol levels. Lots of high energy, fast paced exercise like throwing a ball constantly starts to get those arousal levels up. Excuse me. Slightly talking too long in the heat. Done my throat in, I think. So yeah, low energy exercise, that's really encouraging the dog to be calm, spend some calm time foraging around. So that might be doing things like scattering some treats down for the dog for them to explore, or literally just letting them have a sniff around a quiet piece of woods or some quiet areas where there's lots of plants and smells and things for the dog to check out. So that's a really great way to help the dog manage their arousal and manage and reduce their cortisol levels as well. And the other thing to think about is regular meal times, because that's really key for helping regulate blood glucose, which is just key for kind of giving the brain energy, and particularly giving the frontal part of the brain energy, which is really key for helping control those emotional systems. So regular meal times for more anxious dogs, generally you want to be looking at 2 meals a day at the very least, if not 3 meals a day. So the other thing we can consider in the dog's environment in terms of helping manage kind of fearful behaviours and aggressive behaviours is their attachment bond to their caregivers. So we know that dogs develop these attachment bonds to caregivers in the same way that humans develop attachment bonds to their caregivers, and basically they are able to start to develop this kind of secure base effect that when they're around their key attachment figures, they start to feel more confident and they start to feel more safe. So we kind of get this effect, much like a human child has with their mum or with their dad or with their caregiver. When they're with their caregiver, generally they're more confident. There's some really fun research that kind of shows that dogs will generally explore stuff more and be more inquisitive and more confident around when given new stuff if their primary caregivers are in the room. And for this reason, kind of having a strong attachment can have a protective effect against things like fear-based aggression, but also separation anxiety, resource guarding, and much more that we unfortunately don't have time to talk about today. But it's again a really good way to prevent issues in dogs. And also when you're overcoming issues in dogs, building up a strong attachment bond is going to help with that as well. As it may be that the dog's not had a strong attachment bond in the past, or it may be that the dog struggles to form a strong attachment bond, and you need to do perhaps a little bit more work than you would with an average dog to form a strong attachment bond. So having an attachment bond is key. We know it's key for humans in terms of the way humans behave as adults. If you've got secure attachment to your parents, you're generally less likely to develop aggressive disorders as a human when you're older, and it's probably very similar to dogs. We haven't seen the long-term data, but we do know that dogs generally feel more confident around their humans. So there's a very good chance that dogs that have strong attachment bonds to their humans are gonna be protected against fear-based aggression and fear-based disorders. So how do we build a strong attachment bond? So firstly, being really sensitive to your dog's needs. So responding when they need help and reassuring them if they're scared or if they're stressed out or if there's something bad's happened. So really picking up on those kind of signals from your dog that they're stressed out or they're worried about something or they're feeling fearful. And also trying to avoid putting them in scary situations. So if a dog's not ready to handle a particular situation, then trying to avoid putting your dog in that situation. So the dog can really start to learn that actually their key attachment figure isn't ever going to put them in a situation that's too much for them. And that will eventually start to kind of sink in, hopefully, and the dog will start to learn, actually, when my human takes me out to do maybe a training session, when we start to learn that humans are okay, or unknown humans are okay, or unknown dogs are okay, or something's okay, then it's going to be fine because my human never puts me in scary situations. The other thing that we can look at is also making sure the human or the caregiver is a predictor of good things. So playing calm games with them, just exploring with them and just maybe pointing out some good things. So maybe when you're on a walk and if you're in the woods or if you're even in the garden, just pointing stuff out to your dogs. Dogs generally respond really well to just you pointing stuff out, and can kind of endlessly point at stuff for them to smell. So have a check out that, or check out this. I was taking a German Shepherd to the park this weekend that I was some friends of mine I was dog sitting for, and his local park had kind of a party thing going on the night before. People were just littered everywhere, which is terrible, but also great for a dog. That not a dog that eats everything, luckily, but he's a dog that just loves sniffing stuff. So I was just going around, just have a look at this, look at that old shoe that someone's left there, have a look at that baseball hat that someone's left there. And it's again just teaching them that you're a predictor of positive things, positive fun smells for the dog to explore. And the bonus of that for that particular dog is that dog's a bit scared of humans. So that's actually a great way to introduce the dog to some smells of humans without overloading him with introducing a human in its full form, which is a bit too scary for him. Also just providing love and affection for your dog. So aggression's rare for dogs. They don't generally experience aggression from their caregivers. So it's not normal for dogs to be told off a load by their family group or experience aggression within their family group. So try and replicate that. Try and not just behave aggressively to your dog, to make them feel more at home, to make them feel more normal, because it's not what they would be expecting to experience from their family. And also, again, this comes back to what we were talking about earlier, really try to avoid punishing your dog. So with this kind of environmental view in mind, in terms of how we can manage the environment to prevent aggression, one really good resource that I've kind of created, or one resource I've created, not to blow my own trumpet, you can decide whether you think it's good or not, is something called the puzzle of aggression. Which is just a kind of a way to think about some of those factors that might influence whether a dog behaves aggressively or not. And it's downloadable from our website, Animal Behaviour Count. And it kind of looks at all those things like the dog's early experience, the dog's arousal levels, the dog's past learning, also the social context, whether the dog's nutrition, whether the dog's eaten, and the dog's also neural activity. So looking at things like those chemicals like serotonin as well, and how all those potential things can influence whether a dog responds aggressively or whether a dog doesn't respond aggressively. So it might be quite a good, or it's hopefully quite a good resource if anyone is looking for something to kind of support them with dealing with kind of aggressive responsive or aggression responses. Okay, so the next thing we're going to have a look at is something called distant antecedents, and these are potential cues or potential fear-related cues that our dogs might be aware of that it's really sometimes quite hard to pick up on. And dogs are very clever. They're very good at learning the things that are associated with potentially something bad happening. And there's a few key kind of distant cues that we often see that might influence a dog's behavior in terms of whether they react or not to something. And this is really key, particularly if you've kind of seen dogs or have experienced yourselves with dogs that kind of react very out of the blue, and it's very hit and miss whether they're going to react to something or not. And one of the reasons for that is because there's so many potential things that the dog might be processing that the dog's associated with that fearful response. So if you think of that kind of very simple process of the dog saying unknown human, maybe that unknown human accidentally steps on their toes or something, so we're being generous and hoping humans are nice and haven't kicked the dog. So unknown human accidentally steps on their toes, fear of unknown human develops. But that might have, say, for example, happened in a particular location. It might have happened in the park. So it might be that you get a dog that reacts to unknown humans in the park, and doesn't react to unknown humans on the roads or at home. Similarly, you might have a location-based problem in the sense that unknown humans in the home are a problem, because that causes some fear, because there's some fear around territories, whereas unknown humans in the park and the road is absolutely fine because the dog doesn't consider that their main territory. So also whether the location's a familiar location or not. So actually familiar locations might be a good thing because the dog might feel more safe there, they might feel more confident there, whereas if they're in an unfamiliar location, you might find that they're more prone to responding aggressively because they're already kind of set on edge a little bit by not knowing this location, by having to process all this new information of this new place, that the new smells in that new place, the new sights in that new place that they've not seen before. Also, the other thing to consider is how busy is that location. So is the dog having to go down the dog park where it's really, really busy, there's loads of other dogs around, loads of other humans around, that it's got to keep an eye on and process to make sure they're not any risk to him or her? Or is it quite a quiet park where there's only one other dog across the road or across the other side of the park? Again, a quiet park, the dog's much less likely to react generally because there's less things to monitor. There's more options in those kind of situations to move away and not feel so threatened. And the other thing to consider is kind of the sensory input that the dog's got going on. So whether, again, there's lots of sights, there's lots of smells, is there lots of sounds in the environment, or is it actually quite a low sort of intensity environment in terms of those sensory inputs? Again, some dogs might be more likely to react in a sort of highly stimulating sensory environment, whereas some dogs might be less likely to react in a highly stimulating sensory environment, so they might be distracted by different smells or different sights. So making notes about your own dog, what they do in that situation, is key. Also, whether what the dog's kind of feeling from a tactile perspective, whether the dog's on a harness, whether the dog's on a collar, whether the dog's on a lead. Dogs are often more reactive when they're on a lead. Some dogs are also more reactive when they're on a collar as opposed to a harness. And the reason for that is because when a dog's on a harness, they're better able to kind of use their body language to let other dogs know they're okay. They're better able to kind of turn their head away from another dog, which is a great way to let other dogs know that they're no threat. And they're better able to kind of go into things like a play bow, which is kind of when they put their paws out and their bum in the air. And that's, again, another great way to let dogs know that they're not a threat. So if a dog's on a harness as opposed to a collar, you might find that reduces some of their aggressive behavior and makes them feel less on edge. Also, the time of day. So again, say a dog's had a bad experience in the evening once, they might be more alert when they go out in the evening in future, but actually might do quite well in the morning. Also, maybe if they know that the afternoon walk is where you get the busiest walks, that might lead to them becoming more alert. Also, whether it's warm, whether it's cold, it's been really, really sweltering hot today, so hopefully people haven't really taken their dogs out. It's probably too hot for most dogs, most places in the country. But again, if it's warmer weather, if it's colder weather, you might find there's some differences in whether a dog reacts. They might be more irritable in the cold weather, or they might be more irritable in the warm weather because they're having to kind of deal with that stress of being a little bit hot, having to spend that time trying to regulate their temperature might actually lead to kind of a poorer coping ability. And also the social context. So are you in a training session? Actually, some dogs do really, really well in a training session in terms of not responding fearfully because they're kind of distracted by training, or they've kind of learned that during training, everything's good, but during not training sessions, things aren't so good. Also, if the dog's alone, whether it's on its own at home, for example, and seeing a human come in, or whether it's with an owner, or whether it's with another dog, another companion, whether it's with the whole family going out for a walk as opposed to one person, can all influence it. And there's no particular way that it can influence, that it will always influence it. It might be that with a family it feels more confident, but it also might feel less confident because it might feel it's got more family to guard. And it might, again, if you've got a dog that maybe resource guards a little bit, particularly around people, you might find that the dog is more vigilant and responds more fearfully when there's more people there. So it's hard to know. Again, in the presence of humans, not in the presence of humans is a key one. So identifying those distant antecedents is key, and generally the best thing for that is creating some sort of diary, creating some sort of monitoring sheet that you can use as a way to kind of monitor those antecedents and know how your dog's going to respond a little bit better. And that allows you to kind of predict whether your dog might respond fearfully or they might not. So the next thing is, once you've kind of identified those triggers, is to use those as a way to start managing the dog's behaviour. So hopefully you're aware of your distant antecedents. You're hopefully also aware of your more key antecedents, whether that's another dog coming up to you in the road or an unknown dog, so that's unknown people. So those absolute key #1 triggers that are actually completely causing the fear, or completely the biggest triggers for the fear. And managing those triggers is going to then be key. So looking at how you can that you can manage those unwanted behaviors, those fearful behaviors, so they're not being practiced. And because every time a dog practices a fearful response, so whether that's a dog seeing an unknown dog and responding aggressively towards it, the kind of the neural pathways essentially associated with that response of learning that the dog sees another dog, responds aggressively, that dog goes away, survive that one. That strengthens, that becomes a more practiced, a more better rehearsed response. So it's more likely to happen in future. It becomes the easiest go-to response in that scenario. So the next thing you've got to do is, if you've got a dog that's experiencing some aggression, is you've got to manage the situation so that aggression is not being triggered. So you, for example, if you've got aggression towards a postal worker, you might do something like installing an outside post box until you've worked with maybe a behaviourist or something like that to overcome that fear. If you've got aggression towards strangers, again, there's all sorts of things you can do in these scenarios. You can plan walks at quiet times. You can use things like scenery, so you can quite often duck behind cars, you can duck around bushes. You can use things like anxious dog leads or anxious dog jackets or all sorts of anxious products that are basically generally yellow leads or yellow jackets or yellow ascots that you put on the dog, and it just is anxious and it just lets other dog owners and other people know to not come too close to your dog. Another great thing is to work on an emergency U-turn. So that's quite a good training technique where you work with your dog and you work on something like, for example, turn, and your dog learns that when he hears the word turn, or when she hears the word turn, you're going to turn around. And that's a great way, particularly if you're doing something like walking up an alleyway or walking up some sort of narrow path that you can't get away, you can just turn around and go back. You can sometimes use distractions as well. So sometimes just scattering a load of treats down so the dog focuses on their treats and doesn't notice the dog coming right by them. Sometimes you can get away with using a distraction as well, and that prevents that behaviour being reinforced or being practiced. Another one is just planning your walks really, really carefully. So planning for those quiet times, and also planning your route. So where you're going to go, is there a way that you can kind of negotiate things that you're going to be on a much quieter, a much easier route to avoid other dogs or other people or whatever those triggers might be if you do see them. Google Maps is great for that. You can plan out your whole little walk. And also sometimes for some dogs, actually, it's just too much, particularly if you're in a busy place. So actually doing things like driving to an enclosed field, driving them to their walk. You can hire dog fields now, which is really, really good. So driving them to an enclosed, safe, controlled environment can be ultimately a really, really good way to manage some of those fears and stresses. So the next thing is ensuring that you're able to identify those early signs of fear and stress, because it's really, really key for when those things do go wrong, when your dog is starting to experience fear, that you catch it early, that you can get your dog out of that situation and remove that fear before your dog starts responding aggressively. So again, trying to prevent that aggression through being kind of proactive and saying, actually, if your dog's showing some early signs of fear and stress, recognizing that and being able to get your dog out of the situation. So these are just a few early signs of kind of fear or signs of fear and stress that you might see in dogs. Some things such as inability to settle, if your dog's pacing around, and if you see things like them shaking excessively, self-harming, and really, really key one is increased panting and dribbling in aggressive or in fearful situations. If they're starting to respirate a lot, so if their panting goes up, or if you kind of notice their chest kind of moving more frantically, that's a sign that their respiration levels have increased. Lip licking as well as another big sign of sort of low-level fear in dogs. Again, you're very welcome to download the slides and have a look through all of these in your own time as well. But these are just kind of an overview of some of those signs. And we're going to kind of look at how these different signs can be categorized and how they all present in aggressive dogs in just a second. So in terms of those signs of potential fear and stress in the dogs, there are a few things to look out for. There's 4 kind of big categories of responses that we see in dogs when they are experiencing fear. So the first thing is to fight. So that's that aggressive response, that thing, that fighting response to make that fearful stimuli, that fearful thing, that threatening person, dog, whatever it might be, go away. And the second one is flight. So that's rather than making the thing go away, the dog getting out of there, the dog running away. That's always a good one. The third one that we can often see is freezing. So when the dog stops dead still and you just kind of notice their whole body tense up. And that kind of does a couple of things. It prepares the dog for potential damage or some sort of potential physical trauma, because it means the dog's kind of braced. And it also kind of is advantageous from a predatory perspective, because if you've got some sort of predator, generally predators have quite movement-based vision, so you're going to be harder to spot to a predator if you've frozen. And the fourth one is fiddle about, and that involves two categories of behaviours. So that involves displacement behaviours, and displacement behaviours are normal behaviours that appear in an inappropriate context. So that might be yawning, licking their lips, things like that, scratching, somebody just chewing on themselves, somebody circling around in a circle for some reason, just kind of normal stuff that your dog might normally do, but in a weird context, in the context of maybe something standing there staring at them, making them feel uncomfortable. And the other one is appeasement behaviours, and these are behaviours designed to pacify a potential aggressor. So that's things like, that can involve things like going into like a sort of crouch or a bow, turning their head away, kind of blinking very, very slowly, all sorts of things like that. And generally, we kind of see a bit of an escalation process with these responses. Generally, we start off with the dog that's obviously relaxed and not experiencing fear. And then generally, we kind of move on to some of those appeasement and displacement behaviors. So we might see things like the dog's body becoming lightly tense. We might see some respiration increasing, and we might again see some of those appeasement behaviors like yawning, blinking, nose licking, their head turning away. We might, again, this is where you might see some of those displacements as well, like maybe the dog scratching themselves or biting themselves or sniffing the ground or something like that. And then as that fear starts to increase, we might see some further body tension. So maybe the tail pointing downwards. It might potentially be wagging as well. A wagging tail doesn't necessarily mean a dog's not experiencing fear. It just means they're in a state of arousal. So dogs can wag their tail when they're happy because they're excited and aroused, or they can wag their tail when they're stressed or scared because they might be stressed and aroused or fearful and aroused. Looking at their pupils as well, looking out for those dilated pupils, ears pointing backwards or potentially lowered. And the more, particularly in those first two categories, the more we can see and identify some of those signs and get our dogs out of that situation early, the better, because you're going to prevent the dog relying on those more extreme responses. So that's when we start to see our dog becoming highly tense, that frozen body language, that tail tucking in. This is when a bite's getting really quite close. Whites of their eyes showing, things like piloerection, which is when their hair stands on end. Their teeth showing, staring. And then finally we get onto that kind of offensive action, so things like growling, baring their teeth, biting, lunging, snapping and barking. So the more we can prevent those, the more we can identify those early signs when fear is just starting, or those early signs of fear when fear is just starting to be experienced, and get our dog out of that situation, the better. Because you're going to teach the dog, actually, if I'm slightly uncomfortable, generally my owner helps me out. And generally it's all right, and I never need to escalate it to get that thing away. Generally, actually just becoming slightly tense, or just feeling a slight bit of tension, or my respiration increasing slightly, or just a bit of appeasement stuff does the job. And that's going to hopefully reinforce that, and the dog's going to hopefully learn that actually they never need to rely on growling, baring their teeth, biting, lunging, snapping or barking or anything like that. And again, this is also why we don't want to punish things like growling, or punish things like any of those early signs of fear, because again, that's going to just lead the dog to think, oh, I need to do something more extreme. That growling doesn't work. That just leads to me getting told off. So maybe I should snap, maybe I should bark. So really, really trying to avoid punishment and just become really responsive and help the dog out if they're experiencing some of those early signs. So very kind of similar to that is a really, really good resource developed by Kendall Shepherd called the Ladder of Aggression. And this can just really, really carefully takes you through all those specific signs of aggression. So starting from yawning, blinking, nose licking to eventually progressing to things like snapping and biting. So that's a really, really good one. You can download that online if you just search the Ladder of Aggression. So it's a really, really good one to have and use. And again, the more you can identify those early signs of aggression, those green zones on the ladder, and get your dog out of the situation in those scenarios, the better. So how do we respond if we do see those signs of fear? So offer reassurance. You can't reinforce fear. Lots of people kind of, there's a bit of a myth flying around in the last few years, which I think has kind of died down a bit now, that you can reinforce fear. If your dog's scared and you give them comfort, then you're going to reinforce that fear and make the dog be scared again. But that's actually not true in the case of dogs. Dogs, much like humans, if you're scared, if you've had a bad day, or you're really scared about maybe a job interview or telling someone something, I don't know, or going to a party, I don't know what's scary for every person, but if you're scared about something and someone looks after you, gives you a hug, operation might be scary, that's a good one, gives you a hug, gives you some chocolate, then that's not going to make you feel more scared or make you feel, oh, I should be scared again in future. It's just going to make that fear hopefully be alleviated a little bit. And it works exactly the same with dogs. Offering reassurance can alleviate fear. So strokes, just speaking to them, maybe giving them some food potentially. The other key thing is to reduce or remove the threat. So whether that's getting the dog out of the situation, or maybe getting the person or the threat, whatever it is, out of the situation. So maybe it's a case of asking someone to step back because they're scaring your dog, or maybe it's a case of just saying, oh, we're going to take the dog home because they're not coping too well with this. This is causing them to experience some fear. And don't punish the dog. Temporarily avoid things that trigger the dog's fear. So we're not reinforcing those fear-based behaviors. We're not causing the dog to learn that fearful response is necessary. We're not giving the dog an opportunity to practice that fearful response. So that's doing things like maybe crossing the road to avoid something fearful. Were you using your emergency U-turn, considering your yellow access jackets or leads or whatever you want to use. So that those management strategies that we discussed earlier. Recognize those early signals of fear, so e.g. ears back, cowering, yawning, and finally potentially seeking support from behaviourist if the fear needs to be addressed longer term. So if it's something that's really causing trouble for the dog, looking for support from behaviourist is generally a good idea. And because hopefully what a behaviourist can help you do is change that emotional response. The dog no longer experiences fear in those given scenarios where maybe they're around another human or unknown humans or unknown dogs, and the dog no longer hopefully responds aggressively in those scenarios. So seeking professional support, there's quite a lot that you can do and a lot of places you can go. It's always good to start off with a veterinary opinion because that can rule out or account for any medical factors. So sometimes there's a medical problem that's kind of almost entirely causing the fear-based or the aggressive behaviour, and once you've got that medical problem treated, the aggression stops. Sometimes it's a bit of a mix of both. Sometimes it's a bit of behavioural thing, sometimes a bit of a medical thing. So you need to kind of address both. So sometimes you want to be treating the medical problem, but also seeking support from behaviourists as well. So if you're looking for support from behaviourists, there's some really great organisations out there. There's the IAABC, which is the International Association of Animal Behaviour Consultants, and they've got a consultant tracker for finding consultants wherever you may be. There's the APBC, which is based in the UK. So if you're out of the UK, you'll maybe struggle a bit more with this one, but they've got a good consultant finder as well. And there's also my company as well. We cover Kent, South London, Surrey and East Sussex for in-person consultations, and we do virtual consultations throughout the UK as well. So you can always get in touch if you've got any questions or if you want a behavioural consultation. So finally, all the references for today's webinar are available at the end of the slides if you want to have a look through.